Throughout human history, mourners have honored their dead with a multitude of burial practices. Graves all over the world have provided archaeologists with a window into the culture and belief systems of ancient people. And many extremely well-preserved human skeletons have been unearthed and analysed as a result. Throughout the ancient world, humans were buried in graves, mounds, mausoleums, and even at sea. And most of them, you'll be glad to know, were dead at the time of burial. There are, however, several known examples of historical communities burying human beings alive. Whether as a religious rite, sacrificial belief, or judicial deterrent, this unsettling practice has been used on multiple occasions across the past. And today we're going to be exploring them in all their grim detail. Join us as we travel the ancient world, from the Middle East to East Asia and across the distant past of Europe, to meet those who spent their last moments confined to the earth. Before we begin, please note that this video contains subject matter that may be disturbing or upsetting to some, surrounding topics of human sacrifice, torture, and harm caused to children. Viewer discretion is advised. In 2022, archaeologists undertaking a dig in the city of Anyang in Henan province discovered something remarkable, a massive tomb complex that made up part of the ancient city of Yin. Yin was the capital city of ancient China's Shang dynasty, whose leading family ruled the region between 1600 BC and 1046 BC, making them one of China's oldest dynasties. The tomb complex was composed of several deep pits, dug out enough to be able to store not only horses, but the large war chariots they drew into battle. In some of the graves were the remains of people, likely the warriors who commandeered the chariots on the battlefield. The men and horses interred in these graves appeared to be uniquely decorated, with headgear on the human corpses adorned with shells tied to strings, while the horses' heads were plated in gold and bronze. The long strings of shells in particular are immaculately preserved. Amidst the platings of bronze found at the site, a particular emblem reoccurred, that belonging to a clan known as the K. It would appear that the K clan had massive influence in the city of Yin and were likely extremely wealthy by ancient standards. The tombs appear to have been orchestrated by the K, and many of the burials were accompanied by grave goods, jade accessories, carved stones, and animal bones, in addition to the shells and precious metals. Graves this large are rare and often reflect the power and status of the individual buried within. It is possible that the horses interred in the graves with the warriors were sacrificed as a funeral practice, killed when the warriors died to accompany them into the afterlife. Not all sacrificial offerings in Shang China were animals, however, and there is evidence that humans were buried alive when Shang royalty passed on. Shang religion amongst the working classes was thought to have been based around ancestor worship, totemism from the natural world, and forms of ancient shamanism. Shang religion amongst royalty and the so-called elite, however, was slightly different. Ruling classes are thought to have worshipped Shang Dai, which translates to Lord Above. Shang Dai was revered only by the ruling classes, as Shang kings were thought to have divine right to rule. Heaven permitted their reign. Therefore, while the working classes worshipped their ancestors and nature, extensions of the human world, their kings were permitted an entire new level of religion, and one that was hungry for sacrifice. Written records in Shang China show that sacrificial mass graves, not unlike the ones we just mentioned, were present across Yin and the lands ruled by the Shang kings. Most of the time, animals were killed as offerings to Shang Di, but on several occasions, the deity took human sacrifices. When a Shang king died, he was interned in a large tomb with his valuable earthly possessions to be taken forward to the afterlife. It would also be on the onus of his slaves and servants to volunteer to be buried with him, so they could serve him in the next world too. Vast numbers of servants, male and female, were offered to Shang Di alongside the king's corpse as they climbed into the tomb with no escape. Many of these people had led ephemeral, difficult lives tending to the Shang dynasty's royalty, and unfortunately met equally difficult ends. Other brutal practices in Shang China included the Renji sacrifices, in which times of famine would lead the elite to sacrifice hundreds of slaves. Many of these slaves were captured from bordering lands following raids. Many were decapitated and interned in mass sacrificial pits to be offered to Shang Di. The Romans, on occasion, are believed to have practiced immurement, essentially live burial as punishment for a perceived crime or offense. Those immured would be held in a specially designated chamber or tomb until they passed. It was not buried alive in the traditional sense, but if Christian texts are to be believed, several saints are noted to have met their ends in this way at the hands of the Romans. Immurement in the Eternal City seems to have been primarily enforced upon the Vestals, professional priestesses of the goddess Vesta, ruler of Rome's sacred hearth and flame. Another term for these priestesses was Vestal virgins, on account of their lifelong vows of celibacy in honor of their deity. If a Vestal virgin was found to have broken her vow of celibacy, the punishment was none other than death by immurement. The perceived offender would essentially be sealed into a cave or room, with a small amount of bread and water to last her at most a few days. The idea behind this was that the accused would still be given time for Vesta to intervene and save the immured woman if she deemed her innocent. But of course, this never happened. Sir William Smith, writing in 1846 on the topic of ancient Roman practices, described a typical immurement procedure for a condemned Vestal virgin. He wrote, "When condemned by the College of Pontifices, she was stripped of her vitae and other badges of office, was scourged attired like a corpse, placed in a closed litter, borne through the forum, attended by her weeping kindred, with all the ceremonies of a real funeral to a rising ground called the Campus Celeratus." This was located just within the city walls, close to the Coling Gate. A small vault underground had been previously prepared, containing a couch, a lamp, and a table with a little food. The Pontifex Maximus, having lifted up his hands to heaven and uttered a secret prayer, opened the litter, led forth the culprit, and placed her on the steps of the ladder which gave access to the subterranean cell. He delivered her over to the common executioner and his assistants, who led her down, drew up the ladder, and having filled the pit with earth until the surface was level with the surrounding ground, left her to perish, deprived of all the tributes of respect usually paid to the spirits of the departed. The Romans are believed to have martyred multiple Christian saints, according to the religion's traditions and texts. Saint Castulus of Rome and Saint Vitalis of Milan are believed to have become martyrs when they were immured, the latter of which is thought to have taken place in a sandpit rather than a sealed room. Roman religious authorities are also believed to have sacrificed people to their gods by burying them alive on occasion, although the practice was rare. The most notable instance of this in the historical record comes shortly after the Roman defeat at the hands of the Carthaginian army at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC. Here, the accomplished general Hannibal overwhelmed Rome's forces by surrounding and trapping them, before proceeding to slaughter almost all of them in what would be one of the deadliest single days of fighting in all of history. The defeat saw several Italian city-states defect from the Roman Republic to join the Carthaginians, which resulted in huge losses for the civilization. Panic spread throughout Rome when news of the defeat at Cannae reached the capital, which led to religious leaders consulting the Sibylline books, a collection of prophecies that were only accessed in times of extreme crisis. Supposedly carrying out the procedures from the books, two couples, one from Greece, the other from Gaul, were chosen to be buried alive in a deep underground chamber beneath the Forum Boarium. The chamber is said to have been used for disposing of human bodies long prior to this, and the four individuals immured there must have felt great terror and panic as they slowly ran out of time. Several cultures and peoples across the ancient Middle East are reported to have practiced live human burials, in some cases in particularly brutal fashion. The oldest of these burials dates as far back as 2500 BC in the Sumerian city-state of Ur. Excavations in the city have shown that multiple funeral attendants were buried alongside the original deceased person. Similar to the elite classes in ancient China, the deceased person was likely of high status in Sumerian society, and the individuals buried alongside them may have been their slaves or servants. What's more is that many of the funeral attendees seem to have been buried alongside drinking vessels. These may have contained a strong intoxicant or poison to lull what was essentially a sacrifice into a complacent state, before laying them down in the grave alongside the deceased. The grave and all of those within would then be covered with dirt, sealing everyone in a strange mass grave for millennia to come. Much later, the Neo-Assyrian Empire would take the brutality up a notch. Ashurnasirpal II, the third king of the empire, who ruled between 883 to 859 BC, began performing hellish rituals on those who he had conquered on the battlefield. In his own words, "I erected a wall in front of the great gate of the city. I flayed the chiefs and covered this wall with their skins. Some of them were walled in alive in the masonry, others were impaled along the wall. I flayed a great number of them in my presence, and I clothed the wall with their skins. I collected their heads in the form of crowns, and their corpses I pierced in the shape of garlands. My figure blooms on the ruins. In the glutting of my rage, I find my content." So, not only did the king bury his captives alive within the walls of his cities, he also seems to have taken great pleasure in flaying the skin of his victims, displaying their desecrated corpses for passers-by to see. This would have been an effective way to deter invaders or rebels from attacking Ashurnasirpal's cities. Surely, the sight of a headless flayed body, impaled on a spike after being buried alive, would have caused outsiders to give the empire a wide berth. Eurasia was by no means the only part of the world where immurement and live burial took place throughout the course of history. In 1999, the high-altitude trails and stone cities of the Incan Empire revealed a dark secret: the mummified corpses of Incan children who were immured in the 1500s as human sacrifices. The mummies, known as the children of Luaylayaco, are among the best preserved historical human remains ever found by modern archaeologists. The eldest of the three, in fact, is so well preserved that at face value, she could easily have been recently deceased. The children were discovered in a stone chamber at the summit of Lulaylaco, a composite volcano nearly 7,000 meters or 22,000 feet tall. The practice of sacrificing children in this way was semi-frequent and was known as Tlapak Hucha to the Incas. Children were sacrificed as offerings to the gods to commemorate key events in Inca society, perhaps the death of a ruler or the succession of a new one. Humans were also offered to the gods in times of struggle or famine, to ask for their help in providing for the people. These sacrifices were always directly approved by the Incan emperor of the time, and it is thought that children were meticulously hand-picked from across the empire when a sacrifice was due. Many of them were the sons or daughters of Incan nobles or local leaders. Sometime around the year 1500 then, the Incan emperor, Huayna Capac, approved 3 child sacrifices, perhaps to appease the gods in times of need. The nationwide search commenced, and 3 individuals were called to Cusco, the Inca capital, to serve as sacrifices. The children were a 13-year-old girl, a 6-year-old girl, and a 4-year-old boy, all of whom can be recognized in heartbreaking detail to this day. The eldest girl, dubbed La Doncella, or the maiden, wore a headdress of feathers and was thought to have been in training to become a priestess when she was sacrificed. The younger girl's face had been struck by lightning, and she was subsequently dubbed La Niña del Rayo, or the Lightning Girl. Her skull had also been intentionally elongated by the Incan practice of head binding, distorting the growth of a child's head with the use of wooden boards. El Niño, the young boy, seems to have put up a fight and was certainly not a willing sacrifice. When he died, he was tied up and seems to have been in great discomfort. Once the three children arrived in Cusco, they would have been the center point in purification rituals over the course of a few days to ensure they were suitable offerings to the gods. Inca belief stated that sacrificed children do not truly die, but rather watch over the land in a spiritual sense from the top of the mountain on which they are immured, alongside their ancestors. It was reportedly considered a great honor in Inca society to be offered to the gods in this way, and while the eldest girl seems to have potentially understood this and offered herself willingly, the young boy, sadly, was likely too young to understand what was happening to him. Once transported to the mountaintop, they were encouraged to fall asleep and were placed in a tomb about 1.5 meters underground. Here, they eventually passed away, and due to the dry conditions of the tomb, protected from the elements, they truly are immaculately preserved. Amazingly, arm hairs can still be seen on the mummies' bodies, and frozen blood was recovered from their hearts. The act of burying human beings alive seems to have been a widespread method of religious sacrifice and judicial penalty across the ancient world. Regardless of the motive, these were likely unimaginably terrifying and stressful deaths, with the immured or sacrificed slowly perishing as they ran out of resources or oxygen. Sadly, it seems that the practice of burying people alive as punishment continued throughout history across Eurasia, with the most recent practices seeming to have taken place in Mongolia in the early 20th century.
While it seems, thankfully, to be a rare procedure in the modern day, this brutal practice goes back to the dawn of civilization and likely caused untold suffering to many people.